So I'm going to talk a bit now about crime rates comparing the United States, Canada, and Europe. And in videos where I've touched on this subject in the past, I said I wasn't really able to find any reliable statistics on crimes other than murder for Europe. But now I actually did manage to find some statistics that do appear to be reliable because I've looked at them, but I've also looked at the source that they credit, and they seem to be legitimate. And they're also consistent because I have statistics for several different years and they all seem to line up with each other fairly closely, like similar patterns. So I'm going to link to them in the description. But from my findings here, my overall general conclusion is that the US is far worse in terms of homicide rates compared to every country in Western Europe, as well as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many countries. All the more wealthy countries in Eastern Europe too, like Poland, Czech Republic, etc. The only countries in all of Europe that have a homicide rate comparable to the U.S. are ones outside the European Union, like Ukraine, Russia, and that was true even before the war. And some of the other ones like Albania, for instance, but again, not part of the European Union. So, yeah, all the EU countries, and these stats also cover like Switzerland and Norway and Iceland, which aren't part of the EU technically. But yeah, the overall trend seems to be the US is far worse in terms of homicide rates. But in terms of other crimes, specifically crimes that revolve around theft, which are the other crimes I looked at, theft, robbery, and burglary. In those cases, the U.S. actually isn't always the worst, and many of these overall, Canada and the EU are pretty close to the US in terms of these crimes. And in the case of some EU countries are actually worse than the US, like significantly. So my overall takeaway from this is, why is this the case? Well, I have two possible explanations as to why homicide is the outlier crime in the US that is so much worse, whereas for other crimes that does not seem to be the case at all. Firstly, because of guns. That's the most obvious explanation, that guns, like the widespread availability and usage of guns, makes the homicide rate a lot worse. And the vast majority of homicides in America are firearm homicides. However, what the availability of guns might do in a positive sense is it might actually reduce the rates of theft-related crimes, which would make sense. Because if there's more guns around, more people are probably going to get murdered. However, guns would be a deterrent from trying to rob people, whether it be through robbery or burglary or any type of theft-related crime. Because if you're afraid that the person might have a gun in their house or that they might be carrying a gun, you might be less likely to try to steal from them. Now, in theory, some people say, yes, but wouldn't that mean you'd be less likely to try to kill them also? I don't know. Again, like the way that murder works versus how stealing works, maybe a different thought process goes through the mind of the criminal in each case. In the case of murder, having guns might make them more likely to do it, but in the case of stealing, have the possibility the other person might have guns could make them less likely. Again, like it's a bit counterintuitive because it's like, why would guns make one type of crime more common but another type less common? But it could be a possibility. And I mean, I don't know if anybody has made studies into this theory, but I'm sure there's a possible psychological explanation as to why it would work that way. It could also be that murders tend to be less premeditated, whereas theft, like stealing, tends to be more premeditated. So that could be why people tend to use guns. Like having guns means more murders because it's just often an act of impulsivity. Whereas with stealing, it's like they might actually think it through based on, whether or not they think the other person might have guns, like in terms of a burglary or a robbery. Maybe those tend to be less impulsive on average. I don't know. But regardless, it seems that this is the outcome. Another possible explanation is that because many U.S. states and municipalities have harsher sentences for certain crimes, like, say, like crimes that are not murder, the reason why there's more murders in the U.S. is that criminals are less likely to leave witnesses because they're worried about the ramifications for getting caught for committing a lesser crime. So upping it to murder to them is worth the risk because the risk is so high of getting caught for a lesser crime anyway. Whereas in European countries, they might be a bit less harsh, and Canada, for that matter, might be less harsh on crimes other than murder. So in that case, they might think, killing somebody so as not to leave a witness is not worth it because the potential penalty is being increased exponentially by doing so. So that could be the difference in the thought process there, which would be another reason why the US is more of an outlier in murder, but less so with other crimes, and in fact, in some cases, has a lower rate of other crimes. And that's also, again, because of the fear of getting caught for those other crimes due to worse sentences. Now, again, that obviously varies from one state to another. Like red states versus blue states, that would be more of a red state thing, which would actually make sense because red states do have the higher homicide rates, whereas blue states often have the higher rates for theft-related crimes. So that would actually make sense using that explanation. And yes, blue states, in terms of their crime patterns, I would say are like cluster somewhat closer to, like, let me put it this way, red states are even more of an outlier than blue states when compared to the rest of the Western world and the overall patterns of the crime rates. But nonetheless, even in blue states, the homicide rate is still far higher on average than in other Western countries. So yeah, anyway, looking at the data in more detail, and again, I'm going to link, there's going to be a lot of links here. But looking at Canada, okay, firstly, to define it again, the difference between robbery, theft, and burglary. Robbery is when you mug someone, like when you steal something from somebody by force or through the threat of force. So like a mugging on the street would be a robbery, or somebody robbing a convenience store would be a robbery. Burglary, which is referred to in Canada as breaking and entering, but it's the same thing, actually. I looked up the definition, and it's basically the same crime. Burglary is when you go into somebody's house or property to steal things. So it doesn't actually technically have to involve breaking in. Even if the door is unlocked, it's still a burglary. But yeah, it involves going into somebody's property to steal things. Now, it does not include, however, breaking into a parked car, I believe, at least not in the US or Canada. I'm not sure how Europe defines it. But yeah, that would be defined as theft. And theft in a broader sense is just stealing something in cases other than robbery or burglary. So let's say, for instance, if somebody's at a Starbucks and they see that somebody else left their laptop lying unattended and they take it, that would be theft. As long as there's no altercation, because if there's an altercation, like a fight over it, then that would be robbery. Pickpocketing would also be considered theft, but again, if somebody noticed the person pickpocketing them and then they got into a fight, then that would become robbery. So yeah, theft in virtually every country, theft is by far the most common, and burglary is second most common, and then robbery is the least common. Interestingly, though, on a localized level, in some U.S. cities, robbery is actually more common than burglary, like I believe in New York City and a few others, but again, it's rare. Generally speaking, that's the pattern. Theft most common, then burglary, then robbery, and then murder. Murder's least common, generally speaking, in most places. And again, it's often by a similar order of magnitude between each crime, like from murder to robbery to burglary to theft. Like the amount it increases is often of a similar order of magnitude. So yeah, theft is by far the most common. So anyway, I looked at in more detail Canada, the US, and the EU and UK. I didn't look for any stats on Australia and New Zealand for any crimes other than murder. I just didn't bother. But yeah. Um, Looking at these crimes, okay, for Canada, so all these are per 100,000 per capita rates. Robbery is 56 per 100,000. Theft is 1,025. Burglary, which they call breaking and entering, is 341. And homicide is 2.3. So for the US, and these are 2022 stats, by the way. So for the US, robbery is 66. Burglary 207. Sorry, theft 1,000. Sorry, I'm doing this way in the wrong order. I should be doing this biggest to smallest. Okay. Canada, theft 1,025. Burglary 341. Robbery 56. Homicide 2.3. So for USA, theft 1,402. Burglary 270. Robbery 66. And then homicide 6.3. Oh, by the way, one caveat I should mention: theft does not include car theft. I only found car theft statistics for U.S. and Canada, not Europe. I guess they value their cars less over there. But yeah, Canada car theft is 271. U.S. car theft 283. So we can see for a lot of crimes other than homicide, the difference between Canada and US isn't that great. And in fact, Canada's actually worse for burglary. So that covers Canada and the US. Now, let's look at Europe. And by the way, burglary, theft, and robbery have all been going down over time in Canada and the US. Or sorry, at least in the US. I'm not entirely sure about in Canada. But yes, in the US, they've been going down over time. But again, some people say it's because police aren't taking these crimes seriously anymore. However, there's been a slight increase since 2020, as with homicide. So yeah, looking at Europe now. So for the total for Europe for 2022, now this is for the EU. I believe it also includes Switzerland and Norway and Iceland, but it doesn't include the UK. So the homicide, sorry. Okay, these statistics for 2022 are only robbery and homicide. For robbery, it's 43 for the EU. And for homicide, it is 0.86. Now, in order to get the statistics for the EU for theft and burglary, you have to go back. Sorry, my bad. No. I am mistaken. Okay, no, I have all four of these for 2022. Okay, so theft for Europe, 1,136. Burglary, and this is for the EU. So theft, 1,136. Burglary, 286. Robbery, 43. And then homicide, 0.86. So again, homicide for Europe is significantly lower, like far lower than the United States, even less than half as high as for Canada. Like I think the US is like it's like 8 times or some ridiculous amount like that higher than the EU. But for robbery, the EU overall is a little bit lower than US and Canada, but not by much. And for theft, the EU is in between US and Canada, so close to both of them. Then for burglary, in fact, the EU is higher than the US and lower than Canada. So yeah, for theft, it's higher than Canada, lower than the US. So what I'm trying to say is, for all these crimes other than homicide, they're within the same ballpark. But it's only for homicide where we see these massive differentials, where Canada is like 2.5 times as high as the European Union, and then America is like fucking like 8 times or some more or less. I didn't do the exact math, but I'm guessing like 8 times as much as the European Union per capita for homicide. Now, again, this is making the EU look good, but the EU looks significantly less good when you start subdividing by different countries. And I also looked at the statistics for different states and provinces in the US and Canada. And sure enough, when you start dividing it on that level, it starts looking a lot worse for many European countries. Because here's the thing, Eastern Europe drags the average down a lot. In Eastern Europe, all across the board, the crime rates are just massively lower. And I think it's obviously a demographics issue. I just, if you look at the map, like there's one map of per capita robbery, and it's divided not only on a country level, but on a like subnational level. It's so obvious, like where Western Europe ends, Eastern Europe begins. Like it's basically like the Iron Curtain. Robbery rates drop dramatically. And it's the same is true for burglary and theft. The only crime for which of these crimes for which it doesn't drop dramatically is homicide, for which the Visegrad countries, like the wealthier countries in Eastern Europe, are on par with Western Europe, and then the ones that aren't part of the EU are actually often worse than the EU countries, like say Albania, Macedonia, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, etc. But yeah, for theft-related crimes, Western Europe is far worse, and I just don't see any explanation other than immigration and demographics. Like that just has to be the reason. Like I don't see any other explanation here. Plus wokeness, like in terms of policing methods. But yeah, I mean, this is not looking good. Like these statistics, if you want to argue against like mass immigration, these statistics are pretty fucking damning if you compare the countries that do have mass immigration with the ones that don't in terms of robbery, theft, and burglary. It looks really bad. And I mean, like, frankly, being in Western Europe as a tourist, the people who look like they're going to rob you are the people of non-European descent. Like the one time I did have two guys try to rob me in Spain, they looked like they were either Gypsy or North African. So there you go. So speaking of which, okay, when you divide it on a subnational level, now the most recent statistics were I had to like do some really close-up stuff in MS Paint to try to determine the numbers because they don't have the actual number, just bar graphs. But from what I determined, the robbery per capita, the worst are in 2022 are Spain at 114, Belgium and France tied at 86, and Portugal with 71. Those are the worst countries, and those are often the worst in previous years also. Now, Spain as the worst is on par with some of the worst states in the United States, like California and some of the other worst per capita for robbery. Now, the worst per capita for robbery by far of any state or province or European country, like a state or province of Canada, the US, or any European country, is Manitoba. Manitoba is the worst province in Canada for robbery, and it is off the fucking charts, 232. That is abysmal, and that's far higher than any European country or than any US state or any other Canadian province. That's awful. So yeah, Manitoba is not doing well robbery-wise. But yeah, now for the UK, I couldn't find statistics on the UK for theft and burglary. However, for robbery, the most recent stat for the UK was 2019, and it was 132 for England and Wales. Now, it was much lower for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but they subdivided the regions, and yeah, England and Wales, 132 that's pretty bad. But for homicide rate, it was 1.15 for all of the UK for 2022, which is not that bad. I mean, that's a bit higher than the EU average, but like half as high as Canada's homicide rate. So yeah, so that's for the UK. Now when looking at some of the previous year's statistics for robbery in Europe, Spain, Belgium, England, Wales, Portugal, Sweden are at the top. And those countries seem to be at the top for robbery for every year. And also France was in 2017 and also 2022. So yeah, Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, England/Wales. Yeah, Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, England/Wales, and Sweden. Those tend to be the countries that are worse for robbery. And for burglary, it seemed like the countries that were worse were, again, Sweden, Denmark, France, Belgium, Austria, Switzerland, interestingly enough. So Sweden seems to be always the worst for theft-related crimes. And for theft in a broader sense, it's many of the same countries, with Sweden being the worst yet again. So yeah, Sweden seems to be the worst country for any kind of theft-related crime, like, or one of the worst for any kind of theft-related crime. Like, technically Spain is the worst currently for robbery, Spain or England and Wales. But yeah, Sweden does often looks pretty bad for any kind of theft-related crime. And I think it's because of their leniency and their high trust and their wokeness, I think, make them kind of like lambs to the slaughter in that regard. But yet they don't have a ridiculously high murder rate, which, again, it tells me that, like, criminals there who are probably, like, not probably, like, overwhelmingly are of non-Swedish, non-Western background. They realize they can get away with certain crimes but not others, and that's, I think, partly why the murder rate isn't ridiculously high there. Also because, frankly, they just don't have a ton of guns there, and guns make it a lot easier to kill people. Like, people say, oh, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Yeah, but guns do make it a lot easier. So yeah, I mean, these statistics also looked at, there was some statistic for robbery for individual cities, and Paris is at 611, is by far the highest of any major city in any European country. This was including all of Europe, even the UK, and it wasn't including Russia or Belarus, but it was including, like, or Ukraine, but it was including, like, all the EU, UK, Turkey even, and some of the, like, outlying Eastern European countries. And yeah, Paris was by far the worst robbery rate, 611 as of 2022. That's worse than any central US city, like the main city of its metropolitan area. However, Oakland, California is a bit worse than Paris at 639. But yeah, the next highest city of any city in the US, Canada, or Europe, of the countries that were ranked in Europe, was actually Baltimore at 556. And then there's a bunch of US cities, but Barcelona, Brussels, and Birmingham and London all fare pretty badly in robbery rates also. But yeah, Paris is the worst, apparently, for robbery of any city in a Western country right now. Although, keep in mind, the current rates in Paris, while they may seem like, well, they seem like far worse, because Paris is at 611 and Barcelona is next at 398 for Europe. That's really bad. So Paris is the worst by a significant margin. However, keep in mind, a lot of American cities had robbery rates equivalent to Paris's current rate only a few years ago. Like, well, 10 or 5 to 10, well, maybe not 5 years, but like 10 or so years ago. So it's not unheard of for American cities to have robbery rates at this level. But yes, right now, Paris does seem to be the worst by a fairly significant margin over any other European city, and by like a moderate margin over any American city or Canadian, because Baltimore's next at 556. So yeah, Paris is looking pretty bad there. But yeah, overall, yeah, so those are my conclusions there. So the overall picture it paints is that, is the US a crime-ridden hellhole? I mean, only really when you look at murder rates compared to other Western countries. When you look at other crimes, suddenly the difference becomes much lesser. And in fact, in some cases, it looks like other countries can be worse. But I would say overall, with other crimes, America seems to be in the same ballpark as Europe and Canada, whereas it's only murder where America is really the outlier. And in fact, some of the worst places on a subnational level for the other crimes, or on the level of individual smaller countries in Europe, are worse than anywhere in the United States. So yeah, those are my findings overall.